Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. Welcome to the Outdoors for All community update. And we're going to wait a few minutes here as all of our participants start streaming in. And when that count starts to slow a little, then I'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And as people are starting to come on in, if you would like to put in the chat where you're joining us from today or introduce yourself to the group, please feel free to do that. I'm actually coming in today, not from our offices in Sacramento, but from my home office in San Francisco and the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. Again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as we're having people come on in. I love it. We've got Southern California, the Bay Area, Tahoe, Santa Clara, lots of places across the state. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Okay, I think I'm gonna get started, and those who join us will do so in progress. And all right, so today, this morning, we're here to discuss Outdoors for All. My name is Catherine Toy, and I began my role earlier this year as California's Deputy Secretary for Access. That was a role created to address one of the Natural Resource Agency's key priorities, equitable access to our public lands and cultural and historic spaces. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. And again, if you're just signing on, feel free to put your name into the chat and let us know where you're calling in from today. So our purpose today is for me to provide you an update of the Outdoors for All initiative, talking a little bit about what it is and what we're hoping to do in California by releasing this strategy next year. To talk to you about the process for putting this strategy together and the timeline, and also to share with you some of the findings that I have gained so far in this process, and to get your input and thoughts on those as well. So we have in this public webinar enabled both chat and Q&A. So thank you very much in advance. I know we're all very practiced in these, in the art of Zoom over the last couple of years. So I'm one of my colleagues from our consulting colleagues from Better World Group are gonna put in some kind of community understandings about our use of chat today. So thank you everyone for using that responsibly. And then the Q&A portion will be toward the end of our time together today. And for that, we will use the Q&A function. So next slide, please. First of all, let's talk about why equitable access in the first place, and how did we come about to have my position as Deputy Secretary for Access at the Natural Resources Agency. So equitable access is really, I think, more and more a growing public health imperative, because we know, particularly after the last few pandemic years, that the outdoors is good for our health, our physical health and our mental health, our spiritual health, but access to public lands and parks in California is not equitable. So 1 out of every 4 Californians, or almost 10 million of us, does not have a park or public open space within a half-mile walking distance of their home. And even when nature is nearby, the size and quality of that open space is often deficient, further exacerbating disparities. 6 out of 10 Californians, or almost 25 million of us, live in park-poor neighborhoods of fewer than 3 acres of park or open space for every 1,000 residents. And unfortunately, and probably not surprisingly, these communities are disproportionately low-income communities and communities of color. And this is a result of generations of policy and practice of redlining and other discriminatory practices. So whether or not a person has access to open space and all the health benefits that it provides, because we know that access just 30 minutes a week, and I have to tell you, folks, that's a really low bar to only be spending 30 minutes outside a week. But just that amount is been shown to lower rates of obesity, depression, heart disease, and more than 30 minutes a week is shown to create greater social cohesion. So this is really something, and seeing as how that access is not equal, it's really a public health question as well as a question of justice and equity. The access to public space and whether you have the door open, whether you can come on in to a park or open space, that's one part of access. But a huge part of access is also about belonging. And that's something that's very near and dear to my heart. Some of you may know I began my career as a history teacher, and I always told my students that everyday people make history every day. And that's because I wanted to see themselves in the society in which they live, not as people who were played upon or acted upon, but as actors on the stage of life, in their life. But the richness of civic life in a truly democratic society only works if each of us sees ourselves as part of the story. And I think only then do we feel that sense of ownership that compels us to contribute to our civic spaces and institutions. And so, in my mind, public spaces are civic spaces, and access and belonging in our public spaces are not nice to have, but they're really essential to our democracy. And so, how do we create more public access to open space and public lands where everybody feels safe, welcomed, and that they belong? Next slide. So Outdoors for All, I said a little earlier that it's one of the big priorities of the Natural Resources Agency. It's also a really, I would say, an outgrowth of Governor Newsom's vision for a California for all, one that delivers a more equitable and prosperous future for all Californians. And it also supports the recent executive order the governor made directing all state agencies and departments to embed equity into our actions, our policies, programs, and procedures. Outdoors for All also supports the governor's executive order N8220, which sets that goal of protecting 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030, and it directs the Natural Resources Agency to develop and report strategies to achieve those 30 by 30 goals in a manner that includes expanding equitable access to outdoors and recreation for all Californians. So my charge then is to implement a strategy for increasing equitable access to the state's public lands, cultural and historic spaces. And the really wonderful thing is that our departments have been doing some amazing work in this realm already, from parks library passes for free entrance to state parks and to Coastal Conservancy's Coastal Stories programs to CAL FIRE's urban greening programs and so much more. This strategy will align the Natural Resources Agency's 27 entities so that we can work together more strategically, maximize our efficiencies and synergies, and work for the greatest collective impact. We'll also braid together the strategies of the other Natural Resource Agency priorities of protecting biodiversity and implementing nature-based solutions to combat climate change. Next slide. So the timeline for the Outdoors for All strategy, it actually began a year before I even got here. Back in 2021, my colleagues, Jen Norris and Amanda Hansen, the Deputy Secretaries for Biodiversity and Climate, respectively, they did regional listening sessions throughout the state in 2021. And in those listening sessions, they asked a question in each one of them about equitable access to the outdoors. In addition, they held several different topical sessions, listening sessions statewide. One of those was focused expressly on equitable access. So with that information, we as the Natural Resources Agency gathered quite a bit of information from the public on that. And that is what I would consider phase one of input into the Outdoors for All strategy. So I came on in January, and then during that time, the consultants that I'm working with at Better World Group, they and I went through all of the comments that we received last year to take a look at those and really start to group those and say, what input did we receive? And then in spring and summer, I've spent several months interviewing and talking to the leadership and staff in departments and conservancies that are under the natural resources umbrella. And what I wanted to hear from them was, what are your opportunities and challenges to creating more equitable access in your departments? And the idea there is to really see where can we, as the Natural Resources Agency, both champion department and conservancy efforts, as well as try to knock down barriers that are really vexing to those departments and conservancies in their efforts to advance equitable access. And then between July and October, and actually still finishing up a few of these now in the last days of October, I've been engaged in early government-to-government consultation with California Native American tribes and held 2 tribal roundtables. And I've been honored to do that work with my colleague, Geneva E.B. Thompson, our Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs in the Natural Resources Agency. And then in September through October, we had 6 regional Outdoors for All community stakeholder workshops that were hosted for me by community partners across the state. Those were in San Diego, Los Angeles, Fresno, San Francisco, Crescent City, and Truckee. And then we were also able to do one virtual stakeholder workshop on those as well. And so today, I'm hoping to, we brought together the information gained so far in stage 2 of that process, and are coming to you today with some additional groupings and initial thoughts on what we've learned. In early 2023, just sadly and a little bit scarily for me, I will confess that that's coming up really quickly, the beginning of 2023, and that's when I expect to have the draft strategy released to the public on Outdoors for All and how we're going to embed equitable access into the Natural Resource Agencies, departments, and conservancies and various entities. That draft public comment, when released, will open for public comment, and I certainly hope to expect all of you and many, many more to contribute to that and make that draft strategy even stronger. And then in late spring of 2023, next year, is when I expect the final Outdoors for All strategy to be released. Next. So what are these pillars that I'm sort of been seeing the input to date coalesce around? So this is some of my initial thinking. There are 6 pillars, and I'd like to, six or seven, and I'd like to be able to go through those today with you. And this is really how I've been seeing the feedback to date, the input to date, grouping itself. And this is so far what's kind of how it's being bucketed in my mind. So I'd like to go through that and share with you some of the key learnings over the last year, and also provide you the opportunity to share with me in chat what resonates about what you're hearing and what might be missing. So next slide. So creating spaces for people and nature to thrive. Now, this is what I would say is probably the easiest thing to see. Literally, where are the spaces, the physical access to nature that Californians have? And so I think it kind of boils down to three things that I'm seeing within that proximity, and that's proximity, quality, and diversity. So proximity, one of the things that really has come to me and I'm seeing in this is that nature is not a special treat, right? We all deserve to have nature in our lives every day. And how do we create more green spaces near where people live? So we will always have these wondrous and inspiring state and national parks. But a lot of us don't live close to them. And it's not somewhere where we can easily get to them, perhaps on a daily basis. We might want to go there maybe on a weekend or maybe for a special occasion. But how do we get nature in our everyday lives so that it's not a special treat? So some of the things we heard really around this is how do we create more parks in urban areas so that people can stay connected to their communities? How do we have more trails or connections that are either between these green spaces and connected directly to communities? We also heard from the tribal consultations and roundtables that cultural plant material, resource material is often very hard to get to for tribal members, especially for tribal elders, that yes, it could exist on lands that they can get to, but it's hard to get there or unsafe. So how do we think about how to work to better that access? Quality is another big question or issue that came up repeatedly, which is that the quality of our parks and open spaces in communities is not equal, that not surprisingly, probably, that some are better cared for than others. So how do we invest in maintenance and deferred maintenance in a way that we keep that these public spaces are cared for and that everyone has access to safe and pleasant public spaces? Finally, diversity was a big one, in people talking about the diversity of ways to recreate. And what came up was a number of things, not only that people recreate differently, but that we need to have different accessible parks and open spaces for people of varied physical and mental abilities. And we need to be mindful that we live in a state with an aging population. So that physical access and the accessibility for different abilitied Californians is really important to keep in mind. Next slide. Oh, whoops, before we go there, sorry, let's go back. Thanks, James. I wanted to ask you, and please feel free to put in chat, what I've talked about with creating spaces for people and nature to thrive, what there is feeling resonant about what you've heard. Just feel free to type that right there in the chat. And I know we also have a number of people from different municipalities throughout the state who are joining us today. And feel free to share right in there if there are things that I've talked about and our findings to date that are resonant. Are these things that you're seeing? So I see folks are also starting to throw in there my next question, which is what might be missing from this? And so in terms of residency, so certainly access to natures, not just a nice to have, and people living close, that proximity. And then what is missing? So missing what is terms about, thank you, Ken, for calling out access for minorities, and that is definitely something I'll be talking about. Okay, language access. Yep, definitely also something we'll be talking about. Okay. Thank you everyone for sharing. Yeah, maintenance. Okay, and I see lots of great comments that I think we're going to be hitting on in a few slides. So terrific. Yeah, language access. Again, really important. Collaboration, different types of lands. Okay. So let's feel free to keep having those thread in there. I'm going to move to the next pillar, and that's about enhancing connectivity. So this is definitely something that we heard a lot about. And that enhancing connectivity is literally about connecting open spaces, but in two different ways, one of which I found a little surprising, at least for me. So next slide. The first one is probably not surprising at all, and that's around transit. So how do we build better public transit to public open space, especially to the coast and mountains? And there was a lot of concern from community stakeholders that coastal communities in particular were opposed to public transit coming in and felt like a bit of a, well, I would say tension for sure between coastal communities and public transit access. There was also a lot of comment about public transit not necessarily being a viable solution, particularly in areas. And so where are there other ways that we could look for more innovative partnerships or solutions that weren't reliant on public transit? From tribal members, we heard also a lot about the displacement of tribal members from their homelands, and that many tribal members now live in urban areas that are distant from their ancestral homelands. And so getting to those homelands is not easily done. So what can the state do to assist with that? And then there were lots of conversations around prioritizing active transit corridors that connect both public lands and increase neighborhood connections. Next slide is about a different kind of connectivity. And this one surprised me a little bit. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. And that was about the knowledge gap. And it really shows us how much knowledge is power. So there was again and again, I would say, in every regional workshop and in every conversation I had with our departments and conservancies, was this feeling that people simply don't know what's around them and what they can do there. So, literally folks saying, I didn't know there was a park there, or I didn't know I could use that space. And in addition to that, I think as professionals in this space, it's really inside baseball for us, honestly, to talk about the land managers who is managing a certain property or another. But for a layperson, you don't really care if that property is managed by a city park, regional park, state park, national park, Fish and Wildlife Refuge. You just want to know, how can I get there? What is there to do there? How do I make reservations? Do I need reservations? And so forth. So that is a big one, is that knowledge gap of just knowing what public space is available to you, what you can do there, and how you can get there. And then there's this big knowledge gap around just how do you make the outdoors a habit? How is that a part of your life? And there are multiple barriers for why it's not for a lot of people, and that there was, we had comments certainly around the elitism that exists in the outdoors sector on multiple levels. So how do we make it okay to be a beginner in sort of being outdoors and outdoor exposure? Or how do we think differently about what being outdoors means? And is it more about being outside instead of being outdoors? So, how do we facilitate and shift thinking to empower more people to see themselves as a part of outdoor recreation culture? So in talking about the transit or the connectivity issues, what I shared with you was resonant and what's missing? Feel free to pop that into the chat. Are there things that you're seeing around connectivity, whether that be transit and how you get to parks and open spaces, or around the connectivity as a knowledge gap? And Brian Matsumoto is asking if we can go back one slide to see the transit connectivity. Thank you, James. Happy to. Let me see what we've got in the chat here. Thanks so much to folks who are popping this in there. Yeah, and I see someone is sharing with us from the Sierra communities. This is definitely something we've heard, that you can have nature all around you, but transportation to state and county parks can still be a challenge. And that's definitely something we heard in the mountain communities. Okay. Thank you all for sharing these thoughts. We are going to capture these and save the chat so that we can add this to our knowledge base for forming outdoors for all. Okay, so James, let's get to the next pillar. And that is around reducing financial barriers. So certainly financial barriers, not surprising, came up tremendously. And next slide. So just got a few short comments there because I think they're pretty self-evident. But so one of them is really around just the cost of getting places. And particularly this summer with rising gas prices, this came up a lot. So yes, you might be able to drive yourself there, but if you're going to a park that is further away, that really gets to add up quickly. But there are also entry fees and permits. And so how can we look at those permits and evaluate them with an equity lens? What are the different, I think, as we're looking at particularly nonprofit groups who are bringing primarily underserved youth and other community members to parks and open space. Can we work with them to look at fees for that? That has come up, as well as looking at different ways to get entry fees either reduced or free. So when we look at the state parks library program, pass program, or the 4th grade pass or the adventure pass, those are the kinds of programs that might address entry fees and permits. So renting and purchasing gear also came up quite a bit, which is you can get outside, but being able to take on a new, maybe you want to try surfing or skiing or mountain biking, but there are costs, quite considerable costs to gear for that. And the same is true for learning a new activity. If there are lessons or groups to join, that often those come with a cost. And so that is, even if you wanted to go camping, if you've never been camping before and you don't know if you're going to want to do it, are you going to want to purchase all of the equipment required? So what are some potential solutions for reducing these cost barriers to getting outside? So again, please feel free to put into the chat things that may help or other things that are resonant or missing about reducing financial barriers. And time, I see, thank you. Someone put in the chat that time, because time is money, right? And if you need to spend a considerable amount of time to get into nature, you may not have the time to do that. You may be working multiple jobs and so forth. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, so Diana also put a great comment in there about how do we tackle the perceptions that the outdoors needs to be enjoyed in the traditional way, and agreed that that is something that has come up in the comments, which is there are multiple ways to be outside, and the sort of traditional notion that you need to be out in the great wilderness with a backpack and nobody around for miles. We need to be thinking about how we normalize different ways of being outside. Okay. Next slide. Fostering belonging. So to me, this one is huge. You can open up as many parks and open spaces, but that as you want. But if people don't feel like they belong, the rest really doesn't matter, to be honest. So folks need to not only feel safe and welcome, but also encouraged to be in the outdoors. Next slide. And it really, again, says it all. I think if you don't feel like you belong, the rest of what we do in all of this doesn't matter a whole lot. How do people see themselves in the stories around the parks, in the interpretation, in the signage? And how do people see themselves in the stories, just as many of you have been pointing out in the chat, of being outdoors? Just broadly, right? When you see advertising for outdoor places to visit, or you're on the website looking at a store that sells outdoor equipment, or and so forth. How do you see yourselves in the stories that we tell writ large about the outdoors? So some of the as we started to get into in these groups talking about what are potential solutions, a lot of folks talked about schools, that schools touch all. How do we, at least all in that generation, how do we integrate and normalize the outdoors through our schools, right? So that the outdoors is not a scary place to be, or an uncertain place to be, or an unsafe place to be, but one that feels more familiar and welcoming. Language access is a big part of what fosters belonging. And with more than 300 languages spoken in our state, we've got to do a better job at making our parks and public spaces more accessible and information about them in multiple languages. And that shows up in many places. It's not only in greeting you when you're in parks or public spaces, but also, you know, in everything from our public meetings and our decision-making processes. How do we do that? How do we have folks who work in our open public spaces who represent the communities they serve and speak the languages that of the community? Law enforcement and policing is something that also came up many times as something that often hinders a sense of safety and belonging, that many people feel unwelcome and unsafe with uniformed law enforcement. So, you know, there are probably a lot of ways to try to address this, and considerable work that needs to be done. And then, you know, when we talk about access and belonging, really great conversations with the tribal communities, that access, while we talk about in Outdoors for All that this is about increasing public access, there are definitely places where we may need to pull back access. And that's primarily looking at, there are certain sacred tribal sites that are just not appropriate to be accessed by the public at large. And so that's definitely something that we want to be thinking about and looking at very closely with California Native American tribes. So in thinking about fostering belonging in our public spaces, what are some things that I'm sharing with you that are resonant, and what are some things that we might still be missing? I love all of these comments going into the chat, including some specific examples of projects that might be good role models to look at. How do you should we be requiring everyone to experience outdoor education or some kind of outdoor education is one comment. Matthew Schaefer is sharing with us about the San Mateo County Office of Education, and as somewhere that since I grew up in San Mateo County, Matthew, I really appreciate that. I definitely remember folks going to Jones Gulch. And Leslie, thank you for talking about a BIPOC workforce pipeline. That's something we'll be addressing also in a future slide, because that I think is a big part of creating and fostering belonging. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the next pillar is about empowering communities. And with this, you know, we had heard that procedural justice is really needs to be a part of this equation. Since I began my career as a history teacher, I really like to think about this portion of access for all, which is how do we not just have access to physical spaces, but how do we also empower communities to have a seat at the table in the decision-making process? If communities know best what they need, how do we empower communities to have a seat at the table? And I know there's a two-sided coin to this, which is one about what is needed to empower communities to make decisions and to have a seat at the table. And also the flip side of that is, what does the state need to do to be a better partner with communities for that to happen? So in this pillar, I really just want to be talking about first, what are we seeing around what it takes to empower communities? So next slide. One is that community engagement, we heard again and again, needs to be throughout the process and not just a box to be checked. And this is something in which we're hearing is that partnership is a relationship that lasts over time, and it's not transactional, right? So how can we look for ways to use, for example, trusted community organizations who are essential partners, and how do we strengthen those relationships on an ongoing basis? And how can government, and again, in talking with California Native American tribes in the consultation process and in the roundtables, definitely heard that many tribes would like to find ways to increase, but also to streamline co-management agreements. As First Peoples who have looked after the land for generations, how do we be better partners with tribes to manage the land itself? Networking and collaboration among community partners was something that also came up a lot, which is, how do we build capacity for communities, and how do we enable different community partners to learn and share and work together? Also, what came out in this area was that non-traditional partners were really important to thinking about the advancement of outdoor equity. And those included groups from the health and education sectors, among others, which just enhance that collaboration and partnership. And so, are there ways that the state can help empower communities to work together and be partners with the state? Okay, so I'd love to also hear from you here. What's resonant? What else is missing when we're talking about empowering communities? Thank you, everybody who's really popping into the chat here, because this is invaluable for assisting in drafting this first go around at the draft of the strategies. Yeah, so I see we've got one comment here, but how do we address power dynamics that exist in communities and that enable vested interests over communal, private over public good? Oh, that's such a good question and a really hard one. Certainly welcome anyone to put their thoughts in the chat about that question, right? Because often I find the loudest voices are the ones that we hear again and again. And I've got to believe that being able to really build capacity in communities that have been historically underserved is really needed in order to rebalance who governments most often hear from in the public process. Okay. So thank you. Okay. I see someone here said, personally, they do community outreach and advocate for their community through activism and public advocacy on their own, and share that information with others. Go and speak up. I think the public process itself is really needs to be demystified, and we can do a better job as government about how we engage with communities who've traditionally been underserved so that they have a seat at the table. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So creating an equitable workforce, and I guess I would say creating a more equitable workforce is probably what it should say, because this work is never done. And this is something that many of you already in earlier comments in the chat have referred to, that an equitable workforce and a more diverse workforce, a workforce more representative of the diversity of California, is absolutely essential into making Outdoors for All actually be successful itself. So next slide. So a huge one is, when people say, I don't feel safe in this park or public space, it's because I don't see people who look like me. So we need staff who can speak to multiple facets of history and worldviews, so that it comes out in interpretation of history and of sites, and also literally language, right? That we need staff who speak multiple languages, and that how can we hire perhaps more from the local community. Diversity at all levels of the workforce also came through again and again, that we can't just be diversifying entry-level positions, but it is really vital to see diversity at all levels of the workforce, and especially in decision-making leadership roles. I had a great experience, and I think we've got someone from Outdoor Outreach in San Diego on the webinar here today, but they brought a bunch of their young folks in their program up to see me earlier this year, and I told all of them they should be going after my boss's job, right? One of them someday should be the Secretary of Natural Resources. So how are we preparing not only for different folks to enter the natural resources workforce, but to grow their careers to all levels of leadership? So how are we also, people talked again and again about how challenging government service is in terms of the application process, and that it is not easy to find or know about jobs that come open, and that the job application process can be confusing. So that came up quite a bit. And hopefully we're starting on a new course at the Natural Resources Agency around trying to really remedy workforce pathways into green jobs, because this came up again and again in the regional listening sessions last year and in this year, is that in community after community, what people want are good green jobs for their families. So we also heard quite a bit about youth programs being a really wonderful pathway to transition young people into the workforce, and that those, we should be looking at ways to join those into workforce development. Two big, really cost of living concerns came up, and those were affordable housing for entry-level natural resource jobs is really a concern across pretty much every department that we have. And then, of course, pay, that the state salary levels are not competitive with other job offerings across not only the sector, but in other jobs that folks have available to them. So this is quite an area to mine, and I'd love to hear from you. What's resonant here, and what else is missing that we need to make sure we're looking at? And thank you for all of the tremendous comments that are coming in. Brian here's just put in something that since underserved communities don't have parks or natural spaces, there's little exposure to environmental careers and pathways, and these go hand in hand. Yes. So how do programming and transit mitigate that underinvestment while we're waiting for green spaces in these communities to be created? And that's a gap for programming, right? And for more outreach and engagement. Kenneth Ramirez is talking about using the apprenticeship model and unions. And yes, this is something they're very interested to explore for those to be pathways to green, environmental, and high-paying jobs. I've also had conversations with the outdoor industry and nonprofits about how do we all work together, governments, nonprofits, and for-profits, to talk about really the myriad of opportunities that exist in green jobs. And Martha, I agree, the California Conservation Corps is a tremendous asset for the state. And we are at this very moment working to identify within CNRA how to build better pathways directly from the California Conservation Corps into Natural Resource Agency departmental jobs. So thank you, Martha, for pointing that out. It is something that I think that was something I talked to the director, Bruce Saito of the Conservation Corps, week 2 when I was here. Said, we've got to be able to do better there. All right. Thank you for, I know this is one that you can continue to pop lots of good comments in about. Let's take a look at the next slide. So ensuring accountability. I would say this is AKA, how does the state become a better partner, and how can the state build and change its own practices in order to ensure Outdoors for All is successful? So this is a big one, and this is everything from, how are we a good partner? What are we going to do to be able to be the best partners possible? How do we become good listeners? How do we build and increase our cultural competency? A lot of this, to me, is that we need to be doing our own equity work from the inside out. And this is, I don't believe that any entity, nonprofit, that's where most of my career experience is, or government, can deliver authentically on mission and vision unless we can do that work from the inside out. One of the things that I have a lot of hope for is that I get to work closely on my strategy with my colleague, Moy Moreno Rivera, who is the agency's Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice. And he and other colleagues of mine are really working closely to implement the governor's order to embed equity into all of our departments. And so Moy is working very closely with our departments to make sure everybody is putting together plans for how every department is going to be embedding equity into their work. And the agency itself and the staff of the Secretary's office is also doing the same. So, and many folks in the comments that we gathered over the last year also talked about that equitable access must start with the recognition that historic inequities exist in society. That communities have been intentionally marginalized, and institutional racism has and does exist. And this is an important recognition in order to move forward. Partnership. Also, what came up many times is that partnership building requires resources. This isn't something for a job on the side, right? It requires resources both in how do we, pay honoraria or pay communities for their expertise and input, How do we pay people for their professional and lived experiences? How do we resource capacity building for organizations? And how do we really focus on that building of partnership developments that can be for the long term and for the community, not just for transactional outcomes, project by project. And that, how do we as government learn to do our work differently? A part of this certainly was also about grants, that the grant applications can be greatly improved. Oops, and I'm making sure James said, can we advance this next slide? Thanks so much. So how are we also speaking in plain language? You know, I've read government grants when I was a nonprofit executive writing grants myself. I would sometimes, you know, want to cry when I saw government grants because they were just so challenging. We need to speak in plain language and not in government jargon. And that is true in everything we do. And in fact, people told me, Catherine, when you put out this strategy, it needs to speak in plain language, not in government doublespeak. So, you know, when we talk also about with our colleagues in the tribal consultations and roundtables, again and again, they emphasize the importance of meaningful, early and often government to government consultation, and that there's a lot of attention, more increased attention, which in many ways is a good thing, on tribal engagement from all levels of government, but that also can be very taxing on tribal government capacity. So, you know, how do we also help to build that capacity for tribes? And how do we help to ensure that tribal engagement doesn't just become a checkbox either? You know, so for example, one of the questions that came up is in our grant guidelines and for the agencies, departments, and program grants, often it might ask for consultation with tribes, but we need to verify that that actually happened, right? So does that mean requiring tribal letters of support if a grant applicant is said that they are working with the tribe? So, you know, when we talk about impact and accountability, people have asked, are we mapping our budget allocations and their distribution so that we know that we have systems that are effectively tracking that, you know, we're putting our money where our mouth is, right? Are we mapping those budget allocations and to where those funds are going and for what purposes? And finally, are we measuring quality, not just quantity? I think this idea that we can often count things, how many school buses to parks, how many free passes were given out, how many, you know, fishing programs in urban areas did we run? But what is the impact of those things we count? That's super important. Why does it matter? So, ensuring accountability, measuring impact. Would love to hear your thoughts about that. What are some ways here? What are the things that are resonant? What else do we need to be thinking about in terms of our own accountability and our ability as government to be a better partner in ensuring that we can make equitable access a reality? Yeah, so Laura's reiterating that many tribal groups in their area say that while it's great to be looped in, they're also stretched. We've heard that repeatedly. Jen Green, thank you for your comments that this is particularly resonant for you, how we have to become intentional to overcome systemic racist impacts. So please do continue to put into the chat things that are present, things that are missing. And I am mindful of our time because I do want to get to Q&A. So James, I think that's might be what we have next. Say yes. All right, so I'm going to have James take down the slides for a minute and really invite you in the using the Q&A function to put questions into there, and I'll see if I can spend a couple minutes answering those. Okay. So one question here is, how can we increase community members involved in the non-voting or election aspects of government, like perhaps boards or committee appointments? So one of the things some of you may know is that before I had this role, which also is a political appointment, that I served on the State Parks and Recreation Commission. There are numerous boards and commissions in the natural across the state government, but I would speak now about the ones that exist in the Natural Resources Agency. So, for example, State Parks has not just the State Parks Commission that I was a member of, but it also has the Boating and Waterways Commission, the State Historic Resources Commission, and the Off-Highway Vehicle Commission. All are a family of the boards and commissions that support California State Parks and Recreation. So there, in addition, there are boards and commission seats for everything from the State Coastal Conservancy to the Coastal Commission, the conservancies like the Tahoe Conservancy or the San Joaquin River Conservancy, the San Diego River Conservancy, and so forth. Those all have boards on them. And so there is a process by which, and gosh, this is something I am feeling a little remiss. I should have looked this up in advance so I could throw it in the chat, but there is a site maintained by the Governor's Office of Appointments that shows all of the open seats and when they come open. And so I would encourage people to look at what those boards and commissions responsibilities are, and what kind of skill and perspective that you may be able to bring to help inform them or others that you know. So it's something that we've certainly talked about within the Natural Resources Agency of how we could better partner with the Governor's Office of Appointments to just make these opportunities more visible, and also to talk about what it's like to serve on a board or commission, because I think many of those are ones that are just experiences that people would like to understand more about. So let me see as I'm reading more of these questions. So someone here has asked about, can the C-Corps racial equity training work be shared with community partners and members? So the C-Corps racial equity training is something that is happening throughout the state, and our departments and entities are engaging in that racial equity training. Several cohorts, years of cohorts of this work has been happening over the past several years. And I will just be honest and say, I'm not sure how that work can be shared, but I will definitely talk to my colleague, Assistant Secretary Moreno Rivera, who works with our entities on the C-Corps trainings, about how that might be able to happen. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that now, but that seems reasonable to be able to share that out with communities. And I will add that to my list of things to do, to talk to Assistant Secretary Moreno Rivera about how we could do that. Okay, so workforce, there was a question about, I had mentioned when we were talking about equitable workforce that the agency is currently working on some things about this. So some of that is happening in departments and some of that is happening agency-wide. So agency-wide, one of the new things that we opened in our new building in Sacramento is a career center, and that is staffed by, on a rotating basis, by different members of our department's HR units. And that is something where someone could come in or they could call into the center and learn more about the jobs that are available, about the processes, and somebody can work them through it or walk them through it. I know that, workforce is something that's particularly a subject that State Parks Director Armando Quintero is very passionate about. And he's instituted some things recently where their staff is being trained differently about how to work with potential job seekers. And one of the questions, for example, they might ask them is, if you're interested, they can walk them through, you don't even have to have a resume. Someone from Parks could help you create one based on your experience. So I think increasing the customer service, I would say, around having jobs in the Natural Resources Agency is definitely something we are working on. Where also several of our departments are going through processes where they're evaluating the requirements of jobs and which ones are really necessary versus are trainable. So looking with a more equitable lens through the language that exists in job postings is something that many of our departments are looking at as well. And my colleague again, Moy Moreno Rivera, is convening on a regular basis a group of HR professionals in our departments to work on these things collectively. Okay. Let me see, other questions. And thank you for your patience as I'm working through these. Okay. I think we have answered most of the questions here. What I'm going to do next is share with you the next slide. James, if we could bring up the next slide in there. So today, I've just been able to share with you some of the things that I've been learning over the 10 months that I've been here, and going through the feedback and talking with community members and talking with our departments and conservancies. And, I'd really love for you, if you care to do so, I invite you to share some examples of specific projects, programs, or partnerships that could serve as models for our Outdoors for All initiative through the lens of the pillars that we discussed today. And to that end, we've got a survey that it will be open through Friday, November 14th. So for 2 weeks, you can either scan there right on the screen, put your phone up there, and that will you can scan that QR code there, that will take you to the survey, or Kim Guo has put in the chat just now a link to that survey on SurveyMonkey. And what it will enable you to do is to say, what we shouldn't, any of us, including the state, be reinventing the wheel when there are many great programs or projects that many of you have already been a part of. So if you are, what we're looking for is how might these be role models for things that we might roll out statewide. And I'm most interested in knowing from you why that particular project or program or partnership has been successful. What is it about that program, partnership, or project that was a secret sauce that makes it work? Because that's what we're after replicating. So if you have great thoughts about that related to these pillars that we discussed today, would love to have you do that. Oops, and Barbara is pointing out to me that November 14th is not a Friday. November 14th, then I am going to say it needs to be in by November 14th, which is a Monday, certainly not a Friday. So if you could put that in by the Monday, the 14th, that would certainly, that would be most helpful to us. So that gives you just a little over 2 weeks. One more question I see in here is about alignment with the 30 by 30 priority to protect pathways to 30 by 30. So my colleague, Dr. Jen Norris, and I, have been speaking about this and working about that. And that is that when we all over the Natural Resources Agency, one of the wonderful things that I've been seeing is that we have the ability to create multi-benefit projects and solutions. So for example, one of the things we need to look at is where do we have the most, where in the state do we need to open up, most need to open up more access to open space. And those are areas that we need to be looking at in collaboration with the 30 by 30 effort. And I think that in different communities, the solution will be different things. So for example, it may be in the Central Valley that we're able to reclaim farmland that's going out of production because of the dwindling water supplies, right? And we know that the Central Valley is one of the most park poor areas in the state. So it might make sense to restore working lands out there. Or it might mean in neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods, that that a green schoolyard open to the public or to the community in non-school hours makes the most sense. And that, schoolyards, and many of us grew up in schoolyards where it was majority asphalt, right? And the heat impact of that is tremendous, right? We know the benefits of putting more shade and more green space into schools is beneficial not only for, as a nature-based climate solution, but also to provide extra outdoor green space for communities. So these solutions, again, might look different depending on where these park poor communities are. Mackenzie, I see you've asked a question about how does this align with the Youth Community Access Grants? And the Youth Community Access Grants are funds out of what I would loosely call the marijuana tax money. But we get funds from those into the Natural Resources Agency every year to fund something called the Youth Community Access Grants, YCA. And with those grants are really designed to help bring historically underserved youth communities to nature. And so I think, there are opportunities to look at one, how do we continue to get word out about these grants? How might we continue to build community around the grantees to continue to work together? We may also be looking at, or engaging to see, I think a lot of the grantees would be terrific organizations to speak with about developing that pathway between youth programs and workforce. So Kenneth, I see you've asked a question about in terms of equity, what are we doing to address the disparity in funds and grant monies going out to minority-led nonprofits? So this is definitely a question that has been discussed not just at agency level, but I'm in some working groups right now that are interagency. So it's not just Natural Resources Agency, but with the Strategic Growth Council and the Health and All Policies Task Force, which are really looking at equity. So this particular subject, we've got some working groups looking at this very topic right now. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but I do want you to know that it is something that multiple levels of the state government are very much paying attention to right now. John Wentworth asked, can you share the link to the survey with our networks? Yes, that would be fine to do. So thank you, John, for asking that question. Okay. I see Liza has asked a question. We could expand public green space in Coronado along Silver Strand, but grant sources decline us because there's a judgment we are a privileged zip code. Yes. Okay. So Liza, this question, this problem has also come up to me many times. So I appreciate you asking it here. And I do think we need to look at creating multiple ways to judge whether a community is in need. You know, one of the things at state government that I've seen is that we have many different definitions for what a disadvantaged community is, and we do not have a common tool to use to provide this. And, you know, maybe, you know, there are some grants that use the EPA's tool of disadvantaged communities. There's some that use State Parks tool for the community fact finder. There are others that use a heat climate tool and so forth. So this is something that has definitely come up, and we do have to look at ways to address that. So might it be that multiple tools could be used to determine whether this is an area of high park need? And in some cases, there are some departments which are saying, hey, if you don't qualify during this tool, here's a little section for you to write about what your need is, so we can evaluate that. So Mary asks, how can you align this work better with the work being done in AB 617 and the exciting K-12 curriculum redesign coming down from the Department of Education around climate justice areas? And so definitely I've been in touch with some people at CDE, the Department of Education, and they're very interested in working together. Outdoor education and getting more kids outside is a big priority of the FIRST partners. And so she has convened recently across agencies, folks, so that we can start conversations about how we can align this work, because I definitely agree that we shouldn't be doing it in our silos of our own agencies, because we do better work together. Okay. So Diana mentioned green schoolyards. What efforts is the agency working on to support more green schoolyards, as well as policy change that needs to come to make them more accessible to neighboring communities, and how can you support it? Thanks for asking that question. I was actually at a green schoolyard in Oakland just yesterday afternoon with the FIRST partner. And We do have, and one of the exciting things that we have in this year's budget is $150 million in grant funds specifically for green schoolyards. So that is a grant fund that is going to be administered by CAL FIRE's urban greening program. Because they have an existing urban greening program, it made the most sense for them to be able to get these grant funds out the door as quickly as possible. So they are very, very shortly, because I just myself had the opportunity to take a look at the draft guidelines for those grants. So very, very shortly, they're going to be going out for public review on the grant guidelines. So we can expect to see those funds out quite shortly. And also, anybody who signed up for this webinar today, unless you tell us not to, we'll add you to a new listserv that is going up for Outdoors for All, in which I can alert you of different efforts that are going on. And that would include something like the Green Schoolyards Grant Guidelines going out for public comment. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for continuing to put in these thoughts. So Kenneth Assu says he's recently involved in a collaborative among government, business leaders, community agencies to garner resources going to pre-apprenticeship programs. And the key for that collaboration was diverse held solutions and backgrounds to get that out on the table. So Kenneth, you offered to share that, and the learnings you've had from that, would love to see that. So please do feel free to send that our way. Okay. And Brian says that he just truly appreciates that our team has been listening to the many stakeholders over the past year. How might we turn how might the state turn these many recommendations into policy and institutionalized action items? Yeah. Well, Brian, that's the challenge that I'm trying to wrap my head around in the next several weeks. By the end of this year, that's definitely what I'll be working on, is that one of the things, not surprisingly, that we heard from folks is, and this is around accountability, right? Many times communities have said over the past year, we've heard, well, it's great to have these listening sessions and input opportunities, but many times we just don't know what happens after that. And so my intention certainly is that the strategy, that you will see reflected in the strategy, the input that was gathered over this past year plus. Some of the changes to implement these recommendations that will come in the strategy are going to be able to be just, they're changes in practice and culture. Other things will require policy changes. Some may even require legislative changes, but that's what we've got to be sorting out here, what I've got to be sorting out here for the rest of this year. So, now that the input process is sort of closing down for the moment, so I can start writing, and then we'll open back up again early next year once the draft is out. Okay. I think we've got all questions. I've got a new question popped in here from Dorothy, who says that regional connectivity seems complicated, but can be more successful, that could lead to multi-benefit inclusive projects and solutions. Are there models of success to follow? Excellent question, Dorothy, and I agree. I think that regional connectivity seems complicated, but could be really successful. And this is something which for me means that, I by no means am a transportation expert, but what I do know that we need is more, not only intra-agency collaboration, but interagency collaboration. So this is something that I think is not just about talking to our colleagues at, in transportation at the state level, but it really is, as you say, Dorothy, is this means partnership with local entities, regional entities, and if I haven't said it now, just want to be able to say that the state, we can work and will work better together. That's part of what the strategy intends to accomplish. And it's also about partnering better with our federal partners and also with local and regional governments, because it's going to take all of us in partnership to do this. And we all have different strengths in government, different strengths at the local level, different strengths at the state level, different strengths at the federal level. So how do we solve these together? And I think most importantly, it's because at the base level, the general Californian, again, doesn't really care whether that park and open space is managed, by the local park entity, the state, or the national entity. It really, the outcomes are something that we all collectively, I think, no matter what level of government we're at, want to see, which is safe and welcoming parks and open spaces for all Californians. Okay. Well, with that, I think we're closing that down. James, if you'll, that's the last slide is still up there with the scan for the survey. Thank you for all of you who choose to think about how you can maybe bring some of the great models you've seen work well in your own practice and share those with us. I would be most appreciative to have that. Okay, so with that, that marks the end, and I wasn't sure if we were going to take the full 90 minutes. Seems like such a long time. So really appreciate those of you who stuck with this and contributed your thoughts and ideas today. I hope that you'll share with me again in the survey, and also that you'll be back in the public comment phase to help make the strategy even stronger. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and for your participation.